Hi, my name is Jonathan with the EU CityCalc project. And today we're going to cover a bit about the EU governance regulation and the process for revising this regulation to make it more fit for purpose to enhance local and national coordination on climate policy making. So there were previous videos that we've covered already going into what underpins the EU governance regulation and the NECP update process. So I won't go into detail in that. I'll briefly cover it. And we've also covered in the past how the assessment that's been done of NECPs by the European Commission and others in the last months, which I'll also briefly touch on before going into a description of the recommendations from the EU CityCalc project about how to revise the governance regulation. So beginning with a quick recap of the governance regulation, which, as I mentioned, is already previously covered in another video. So just as a reminder, there are two articles in the governance regulation that are quite important with regards to ensuring public consultation and participation and what are called multi-level climate and energy dialogues. So Article 10 states that each member state of the European Union needs to ensure that the public is ensured early and effective opportunities to participate in the process to draft national energy and climate plans of member states. Member states are supposed to ensure that the public is well informed and sets reasonable timeframes for this to happen to ensure that the public has enough time to process and give feedback on these draft plans. And moreover, member states are meant to attach in their submission to the Commission a description of how the public's views have been taken into account, what these views are, and how these have been reflected. And Article 11 specifically speaks to the fact that each member state needs to establish what is called a multi-level climate and energy dialogue. And the point of these dialogues is to ensure that local authorities like cities and other municipalities, as well as civil society organizations, businesses, and other important stakeholders are able to actively participate in discussing the government's plans, the different scenarios that are envisaged, and can weigh in on the general process for defining national energy and climate plans. What we see in reality is that these articles are not always well upheld. So the current NECP update process, which is just going to finish actually at the end of this month of June 2024, where member states are meant to submit their final updated NECP. So this is a process that has been going on for some time now. And essentially what we see is that already in December of 2023, so just about 6 months ago, the European Commission published an assessment of the draft NECPs that had been submitted by member states 6 months before, so in June of 2023. And what the European Commission highlighted is that essentially, especially the articles regarding public participation and multi-level energy and climate dialogues are lacking. So for public participation, while the Commission notes that most member states organize consultations with the public about the draft plans, the quality nonetheless varies quite a lot, and many member states did not cover all the obligations that are set out. So this can be regarding unreasonable timeframes for the public to give views on plans, or not that the fact that all information is not provided, so that the public is not seeing a comprehensive final version, or there's too limited time to actually properly process these complex and long documents. And of course, there's more detail on the actual assessment, which will be linked to. And then regarding multi-level energy and climate dialogues, there is a similar sort of patchy progress that's noted. So while the Commission, of course, notes, which is important, that local and regional authorities are important for the implementation of energy and climate policies, as we well know in the EU CityCalc project and as others would know as well, the reality is that very few member states actually have concrete evidence to show how they involve these authorities in preparing and updating their draft NECPs. And even fewer build on this process on a multi-level dialogue in the course of this process. And there are other assessments of NECP updates that are even more critical than the European Commission. So for example, This is a Climate Action Network Europe, which is a group of NGOs in Europe, and the Together for 1.5 project did a comprehensive assessment of submitted draft NECPs in the last year. And they had found that many of them are lacking, in particular when it comes to public participation, as well as multi-level energy and climate dialogue. So without going into detail here, we see that this is sort of non-existing or very poor public participation, or much to improve. And you can see essentially every single member state falls into one of these categories, with many falling into the non-existing or poor public participation categories. And the European Community of the Regions, in fact, has gone a bit further and said that, considering that the poor quality of multi-level climate and energy dialogues and consultations in some member states, in fact, poses a serious threat to the successful implementation of the government regulation, which they stress, of course, can only succeed with genuine involvement of cities and regions. So the European Commission, in its assessment, which I was covered briefly before, gave some recommendations to member states, noting that public participation, that member states need to ensure an inclusive process with reasonable timeframes, and that there needs to be broad participation, so of local authorities and civil society as well more broadly in preparing this plan. And then regarding multi-level energy and climate dialogues, the European Commission calls on member states to provide a clear overview of how these consultations occurred, how broad public participation was secured from all of the relevant stakeholders that should be consulted on this, and generally speaking, how these views have been expressed and how they were integrated into the planning processes. So essentially, much more disclosure about, concrete disclosure about what happened on the ground. Now, and of course, these recommendations are important, but it is worth noting that the Commission is essentially reiterating existing requirements that are already meant to be covered by Articles 10 and 11 of the Governance Regulation. And so what we see, and this is something that we have witnessed in the EU City Calc project, and other projects as well have witnessed the same thing, is that overall the EU Governance Regulation is not fit for purpose to enhance proper multi-level climate policy making between national, regional, and local levels of government. And this tends to be because there's a widespread prevalence of flawed public consultations and multi-level dialogues. And there's also been a lot of policy and geopolitical developments since the initial adoption of the governance regulation, of course, which was several years ago. And so the policy landscape has also changed quite a bit, which is another reason why the governance regulation needs to be urgently revised in a deep manner. And so currently it's planned for this revision to start potentially in 2025. Of course, this is slightly dependent on political developments and how the new European Commission will be formed, but this is still the expectation. And along those lines, EU City Calc has prepared several recommendations. So in a report which you can find on our website called Revising the EU Governance Regulation for Enhanced Local and National Climate Action, Recommendations from EU City Calc, we've provided more detailed recommendations, which I will speak to briefly here. So first is, essentially, when the European Commission and the related EU institutions and committees in the policymaking process begin this process of revising the governance regulation, it's really important to significantly strengthen the enforcement frameworks, notably that are given to the European Commission to ensure that the Commission has a stronger mandate. So, for example, broadening this mandate so that the Commission can potentially reject or incomplete or unambitious NECPs. So if member states are, not showing the level of ambition that's required, or are reporting, submitting their NECPs with significant delays, at the minimum, there should be an obligation for the European Commission to be able to require member states to address gaps in their reporting, to clarify information that maybe is not evident, or to increase the ambition of their NECPs. So if there's not an ability to sort of outright, reject, which maybe can be a bit severe depending on the circumstances, there should be at least provisions in place for the Commission to require member states to further justify, information. And this could even extend to applying, sort of penalties or other corrective measures. For example, if member states don't submit their NECPs and the progress reports on time, or if, as we've seen in the last NACP cycle and the one before that, if they're failing to uphold Articles 10 and 11 of the governance regulation, which are really crucial for ensuring better holistic policymaking across levels of government. And it's also important for the governance regulation revision to ensure that there's better integrated reporting by member states in their NACPs and related progress reports. So, for example, an important improvement could be to have reporting on the commitments, data, and measures of cities and local authorities. So there are many different initiatives, of course, SACAPs, climate city contracts, local green deals, etc., in which cities often engage voluntarily to enhance their climate ambition, and which there's many commitments, data, and relevance measures that should be reflected better in national policymaking. And so including a provision for this information to be reported in NACPs could be a way to improve the dialogue between different levels of government. And so this, also having reporting on the support and resources that national and EU governments provide to support local implementation. So that would also help to increase accountability to ensure that the national government is really supporting local authorities who often are ambitious but need some support as well. And so some of these changes could be integrated by expanding the NACP template and related reporting requirements. And then now next, another core factor is regarding the multi-level energy and climate dialogues. So really there needs to be a big improvement to these processes, which are not implemented in a stellar manner across all member states at the moment. And so one important first change is to require there to be a permanent structure in place, so that these dialogues are not just put in place temporarily when there's a revision, when there's an update of NACPs, but for there to be a permanent structure which can meet consistently, not only during the NACP update cycle. And there should also be, additional minimum requirements of reporting. So countries should also report on, in their NACP process, the number of meetings that are held. So this should be, 3 times a year outside of the NACP update process. We would suggest potentially up to as much as 6 times a year during the NACP update. This could be once every 2 months. This could be adapted potentially depending on the context. And there should also be good representation of different stakeholders. So, at a minimum, there could be 6 organizations that represent local authorities and cities. And it's important as well for there to be NGO and civil society representation, so at least sort of 3 NGOs and CSOs. Of course, the makeup can depend on the member states and their context. These are indicative minimums, but it could be higher, of course, and in many cases should probably be higher. And then there should be also clear binding reporting requirements about the dialogue. So for member states to need to report on who participated in the multi-level climate and energy dialogues, what was discussed, how did these discussions inform policymaking. These are sort of the key aspects here. And regarding public participation requirements, so here there should be better requirements for member states to elaborate engagement strategies for how they are intending to ensure wide representation in their consultations. So what is their strategy and approach to ensure that they will reach out to different stakeholders through different means of communication, because we know that not the same means of communication will not work for all stakeholders in the public. And for there also to be clear minimum time frames for engagement. So we would recommend for there to be a minimum 4-week consultation period. Now this consultation period should finish 2 months before the deadline to submit draft NACPs and final NACPs. Because if it's done too close to the date, within 1 month, for example, it leaves very little time for the member state to ideally reflect what the input is from the public. And that's something that we've seen in the current process gone wrong sometimes. And then, of course, there should be better requirements to report in detail on the above elements, on the engagement strategies, minimum timeframes, and how the public's views have been taken into account. So that's a quick overview of the recommendations in the EU CityCalc project about the need to urgently revise the EU governance regulation to make it more fit for purpose. There's more information in the detailed report, and we have included some links in the description of the video. Hope this is interesting, and thank you for your time.